All right. So the last section we were just talking about, we saw the division between these two roads of is and is not. All right. So here's the road of is and impossible it not be, and here's the road of not and needful it not be. But call to mind the significance of the impossible it not be, so that this one, which recall also was truth, right, must be essentially eternal because it can never not be, right? Okay. So the road of not and the road of is. Now, the poem continues. Number 3 through 6 are rather short, so I'll just read them quickly here. For the same thing is there both to be thought of and to be, right? So we already talked about that. Knowledge is equal to being, which then tells us that what we can know has to be eternal, which means that knowledge will be incredibly rare, and what we call knowledge has to be related to things that don't change, right? Which kind of makes sense, because if you're going to say that to know is equal to being, right? So knowing is equal to being. If we were to say something like, suppose you were to say that I know this tree is green. You know what? Let's use cat. I know this cat is fuzzy. Okay, whatever. Now, there I'm using is. But in what sense am I using is? Am I using it in terms of impossible it not be? In other words, could it be possible for the cat to not be fuzzy? Well, indeed. Right, when the cat was a fetus, it was not fuzzy. And when the cat is dead, it will not be fuzzy. So it's very possible that the cat is not fuzzy. So when I say the cat is fuzzy, there's kind of a contradiction in a way. Because what I really mean is the cat is fuzzy for now. Right? Because the cat wasn't fuzzy, and the cat will cease to be fuzzy. But if I say something like 2 plus 2 is 4, there I'm using the is again, right? But this time, there's never a point at which 2 and 2 is not 4. I mean, 2 and 2 is always 4. So when I say 2 and 2 is 4, I mean forever, right? I don't mean now. I don't mean until the 4 dies. I mean forever, because this is a logical statement, and the logical statement doesn't ever change. In other words, you can't ever think of a time in which 2 and 2 is not 4. Now, you might say, well, eventually the human race will die out, and so there won't be people who will think this thought, but nevertheless, it will still be true. All right. So, knowledge and being are one and the same. All right, now let's think about this. Let's continue back to the poem. All right, so then she continues, but look at things which far off are securely present to the mind, for you will not cut off for yourself what is, from holding to what is, neither scattering everywhere in every way in order, nor drawing together. It is a common point from which I start, for there again and again I shall return. What is there to be said and thought of needs must be, for it is there for being, but nothing is not. I bid you ponder that, for this is the first way of inquiry from which I hold you back. Okay, so she's saying, look, don't go down this path. This is the path of is not. Don't go down there. But then from that on which mortals wander, knowing nothing. First, mortals wander down here. Now, do you remember he was on the road of the goddess, right? G for goddess. And it was immortal charioteers, right? And remember, our guy is standing here. And so he's learning about the distinction between is and is not, because he is a just man. But the goddess is immortal. The road is immortal. The chariot is immortal. But mortals wander knowing nothing. So the opposite of mortal, of course, is immortal. Because the thing is, something like 2 plus 2 equals 4 is immortal in that regard. But so things that come and go, in other words, mortal things, wander down this path, knowing nothing. And as we just saw, right, you can't know nothing because there's nothing to know. Unless you think of nothing in terms of zero or the word nothing, which really is an admission that we don't know anything, really. They are, what? Two-headed, for helplessness guides their wandering thought in the breast, and they're carried along, deaf and blind at once, dazed, undiscriminating hordes. Okay, so these are undiscriminating. And then he said, Parmenides said hordes. All right. Who believe that to be and not to be are the same. So they confuse being and not being. All right? They think they're the same thing. And the path taken by them is backward turning. And so when these guys come down this path, they turn back, and then they turn back, and then they turn back, and they turn back. It's backward turning. Okay. So let's see. First of all, these are people who are mortal, right? So they're mortal. In other words, they come to be and go away. They are not immortal. And they know nothing, but it's impossible to know nothing. In fact, they confuse being and not being, when in fact being and not being are absolutely different things. Hence, not being and being. They're not the same. They're different. And they are also undiscriminating hordes. And so discrimination, I know in our culture discrimination is a bad word, but really the word simply means to be able to tell between two things. So when you discriminate between coffee and poison in the morning, well, that's good, because you can tell the difference between the two. So undiscriminating hordes, in other words, who confuse being and not being, don't even see this distinction. Right? So they don't see that there's a distinction between is and is not. So for them, since they go down the path of is not, and they think that everything is the same, they don't even see this path. Like for them, this whole reality doesn't even exist. In other words, they don't even have a sense of is not. Okay. She continues. For never shall this be forcibly maintained that all things that are not are. So in other words, not can never come into being. Right? And think about this. If you have a whole bag of nothing, what can you make out of nothing? Well, nothing, right? So from nothing comes nothing, the Latin nihilo ex nihilo. But you must hold back your thought from this way of inquiry, nor let habit, so she says, don't let habit force you down, nor let habit, born of much experience, force you down this way, by making you use an aimless eye and ear and a tongue full of meaningless sound, judge by reason the strife and compass refutation spoken by me. So habit, in other words, is what moves people down this road to the is not. Because these are people who are undiscriminating, so can't even see the difference between not and is. To them, there is only not, and in fact, not becomes is. Because for these people, ultimately where we're going is the physical, which comes and goes and is not, is. So they assume that the physical is eternal. And that's their entire conception of reality. Whereas what Parmenides is trying to show us here in the poem is that there is also the world of the is. But the world of the is, these guys down here don't even have a clue exists, because their only world is the is not. They lack the ability to discriminate between is and not. They call being and not being the same, and they wander about, and they're confused. And so one day they believe X, the next day they believe Y. All right. Now, what does she say about the next road? So then she continues in number 8. Only one way remains that it is. To this way there are many signposts that being has no coming to be and no destruction. So no coming to be or destruction. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, that means it can't come into existence because it's always been there. So there's never a time in which it's created. Nor can it be destroyed, because again, if it was destroyed, there would be a point at which it did not exist. For it is whole of limb and without motion, right? So it is whole and motionless. And it has to be whole and motionless because if it is not whole, right? So, suppose here's my perfect circle with a chunk missing. Well, then you're like, this is something that's lacking. So that would be not. And this would be the is. And so you can't have that not, right? Because it doesn't have any not. And therefore is must be complete. Also, it can't move. Because if it moves, suppose, as an example, right? Just suppose we have point A, point B, and the world of is moving from point A to point B. That would mean here the is starts, and when it moves over here now, but notice the is not here, right? Because it's here. And then, if it moves, right? And so now it's over here, that means it's not over here. Not is not contains the contradiction. So it can't move. Okay, that's locomotion. But it also can't revolve around. It can't move from within. To the Greeks, what motion is when they're talking about motion, I mean, there's a couple ways to consider motion. There's motion in terms of locomotion, right? Which we've been just talking about, locomotion. But then there's also change, right? And so as you could think of even here a blade of grass, right? Here's a blade of grass. And it has like a root system. Actually, they're very simple roots. When the blade of grass takes in nutrients and water and stuff, right? So it draws up from the soil to itself. It creates motion in things, right? And so you could think of if the blade of grass is drawing up water, here's the water, and the grass pulls the water up here, that would mean that the grass goes through a process of having the knot, because the water is not in the grass, and when it pulls it up, now the water is in the grass. And so even change from within, right, if something changes, it moves from a state of what it wasn't into a state of what it is, which means it's in a state of coming to be. So therefore, our whatever is also cannot be in motion, either locomotion or change. All right. Next she says, oh, and it can be without end. I mean, that's obvious, right? It cannot have any end, so it's endless, so we can write eternal. All right. Now this is the path, she says, you should go down. And in fact, this is the path that the just man goes down. Because the just man is concerned with things that don't change. Because if something is, it can't change in the same way that 2 and 2 cannot be anything other than 4. Down here in the world of not, if we're going to say, for instance, what is the greatest rock band of all times, here we could say that Kiss